I'm sorry, because we're recording this. I'm so sorry. This talk is being recorded and it will be broadcast by the London School of Economics, where I shall be working as of March 2019, which is why I am speaking in English, and I'm afraid you have to put up with the translation if you need it. So thank you to Marcela for the lovely introduction, for the lovely lunch, and for the warm welcome and the invitation to talk about our Observatory of the Quality of Employment, which we launched this week on Tuesday. And it's a pleasure to present the results of our first study. There are many other studies underway, and there will be more information released as we go on, in particular about Chile. But for now, this is a study about Latin America. Before I go into the detail, I'd like to thank my team. This research isn't just my own. I've been working with Pablo González from the Universidad de Chile, with Mauricio Apablaza from the Universidad del Desarrollo and from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and with our wonderful, spectacular assistants, Rocío Méndez and Verónica Arriagada, who have been working with us and helping us for the data. Without them, this wouldn't be here today. So just as a brief introduction, the subject of the quality of employment, under different names, decent work, job quality, etc., has been around for a long time. In 1999, the ILO launched the concept of decent work, and we all had great expectations and hopes that this would lead to some kind of a measurement and definition of the concept of decent work. That hasn't really happened for a number of different reasons, mostly because the ILO is a tripartite organisation with all three social actors incorporated into it, i.e. governments, employers and unions, and they've never really been able to agree on what we mean by the quality of employment, let alone how to measure it. So this created a lot of interest in better jobs, in job quality, etc., but we still lack international measures. More recently, progress has been made on this issue though, especially because in Europe there's something called the European Working Conditions Survey, which is now being undertaken in 32 countries worldwide, mostly developed countries, but also some developing ones. And this gathers data on employment conditions much, much more broadly, and this has been used to calculate one of the first job quality indicators that was published by an international institution. In this case, it's the OECD that brought out a job quality indicator. But unfortunately, even though Chile is a member of the OECD, the line for Chile in this indicator is empty, or rather there isn't one for Chile, for the very simple reason that in Chile we don't have data on employment conditions that is comparable to international surveys. I'm going to give you a very brief overview to give you an idea of what we mean by job quality and what has been done so far in the literature. In developed countries, job quality tends to be associated with dimensions such as the ones that are up on the slide here. So of course earnings is always a very important part of job quality. But in Europe you can also consider job prospects, meaning how secure your job is, what your career progression is, the quality of your contractual situation. Then there's intrinsic job quality, with a number of dimensions that are incorporated in that: skill use, discretion, whether you're managing other people, etc., your work environment, intensity, and working time quality, meaning the duration of your work, scheduling, discretion, short-term flexibility, etc. All of these are dimensions on which I have no information in Chile that would be comparable to other countries, and with which I could construct such an indicator on a regular basis. Probably most of you know this. What this particular study by Green and Mustafa has done is they have produced a dashboard of indicators, which is a great summary of what's going on in the countries concerned, but it makes it very difficult to compare countries among each other. And of course, it's not just in Chile that we can't produce an indicator like this, but in all other countries of the Latin American region, and indeed in other developing countries, we would not have this level of information on job quality. The OECD simplified things and basically included three dimensions in their index: earnings quality, job security, and the quality of the work environment. Again, This is a lovely dashboard summary of what's going on with job quality in the countries that are included in this indicator. And again, I don't have all the data required for Chile for this. As I mentioned, Chile is not part of this indicator. The OECD did try in 2015 to publish a study with emerging economies, but they ended up having to replace a number of variables with proxies, because basically there is no information on the quality of the work environment. Now, the other thing that's important to consider here is that this is not an indicator of individuals, it's an indicator that uses macroeconomic summary variables. And this has very important implications when it comes to studying the quality of employment, because it means you cannot break down the results of the indicator according to individual groups of the population, according to regional or smaller units, like particular groups of workers in a particular economic activity or regional location, etc. So the minute you start using macroeconomic variables, the uses and the applicability of your indicator and its usefulness to public policy making is therefore much restrained. More recently, the Inter-American Development Bank also produced an indicator called Better Jobs Index, measuring the quantity and the quality of employment with the standard data that's available in Latin America. So on the one hand, you have variables of quantity, i.e. participation, and the employment rate, and in the other dimension, you have the level of formality and whether a worker is earning a living wage. This is tremendous progress for the region in the sense that an international development institution has come out with an indicator that actually makes an attempt and an effort to measure the quality of jobs. However, again, it has the same problem. It does not look at individuals, these are macroeconomic variables, and so therefore you can look at the country, you can compare countries within the region, but you cannot break this down very easily. So, there are some important preliminary conclusions that come out of this though. The first is that there seems to be a consensus now at a international level, as well as at a regional level, that job quality is important. That's tremendous progress. Second, there seems to be a consensus that it should be measured in some way. So again, if you think about the 20 years going back to when the ILO launched decent work, that is progress. The first synthetic measures of employment quality are being developed, as you saw with the IBD. But, of course, this exercise and the results I'm going to show you today, on the one hand show that you can measure quality of employment, but on the other hand they also show how much we lack data and better information. So standardized surveys of labour markets, job quality, employment conditions in Latin America are very much necessary and haven't been implemented yet. And Chile, of course, being a member of the OECD, along with Mexico, should be one of the first countries to implement such an indicator and such a survey indeed. So where we stand at the moment with this subject is roughly where we stood on the issue of poverty, when poverty was still being measured based on income data, based on absolute income data. The Alkire-Foster method then came along to aggregate multidimensional variables in a single indicator, and that has since then become a widely used measure of multidimensional poverty. In Chile we have had such an indicator already for a number of years, it's been changed, it's been adapted, etc. But there was a commission in Chile that was established, a commission of experts, and they determined how this indicator was to be measured in the future going forwards. The same thing needs to be done now for the quality of employment, which, as you all know, is a multidimensional concept, and we should be thinking about producing an indicator every time we think about unemployment. We should also be thinking about the quality of the employment that we have. And it is indeed possible to do so. In Chile we have data from the NENE, from the CACEN. We also have longitudinal data from the EPS. And you have basic variables in all of these surveys. You have more variables in the CACEN, but of course that isn't carried out as frequently. Ideally there should be a module on working conditions in the NENE, and there should be a labour market survey that gathers information on these variables at least once a year in Chile that is more detailed. So, the reasons why we need to measure the quality of employment On the one hand, it's because we simply need to be, we need to be aware of what is going on in our labour market. We need to know what our quality of employment variables look like, because otherwise it's impossible to implement other reforms without bearing this in mind. The best example of this is the Chilean unemployment insurance system, which actually was designed at a time when we didn't have this information, and which was designed according to principles of individual contributions, which just simply do not take into account the reality of the Chilean labour market. And that explains in large part why, despite 2 reforms that make the unemployment insurance system more generous, its coverage is still so low. So we need the information for social security reforms. We also need this information in order to make better public policy decisions. How do you allocate fiscal resources? Who do you give them to? Employment subsidies? Who are the best candidates for this? And so on. And again, one important topic, and one that Brendan has been talking about this week, is what will happen in the future when technology and artificial intelligence begin to change the face of our labour market. We need to know more about our jobs in order to be able to estimate what those changes are going to be like. So without further ado, I'm going to present our indicator. It has 3 dimensions. The first is employment conditions, labour income, and employment stability. And within each dimension, in 2 of them, we have further variables. So in labour income, it's just the income from the main occupation at the moment that we're looking at. In employment stability, we are considering the occupational status of the worker, i.e. whether they have a contract, whether they are salaried but don't have a contract, whether they are self-employed, professional self-employed employers. In tenure, we are just simply considering the number of years a worker has spent in the same job. And in employment conditions, we are considering whether a worker is affiliated to a social security system and their working hours, whether they are above 45 hours. Unfortunately, here in the dimension of social security, I do not have comparable data in Latin America about social security contributions, just affiliation. So if this were just a Chilean study, of course, here I would be looking at contributions and whether those contributions are currently being met. But in Latin America, overall, I can't do this. The idea then is in every dimension and sub-dimension of this indicator to establish a cutoff line. So from which point onwards, or below which level, do we consider a worker to be deprived in a particular dimension? And here in the income dimension, we consider a worker to be deprived when they have an income, a wage from their main employment of less than 6 food baskets. So the poverty line for an individual worker is 2 food baskets, and we have to consider that workers are generally have at least 1 dependent, and we want them also to be a little bit above the poverty line, hence the 3 food baskets per person, or 6 per worker, because we want them to be able to function, not just not be starving, but function in the labour market and have some degree of capability to develop themselves in the labour market. Workers without a contract, who are salaried workers, and the self-employed, the non-professional self-employed, are also considered to be deprived, because those, of course, are the most precarious occupational statuses. Equally, workers who have been working for less than 3 years in the same job are considered deprived according to this indicator. This is controversial, and I'm very, very happy to answer questions about this later. But the basic idea is that you need, from 3 years onwards, there's a degree of job stability. Your job stability increases after 3 years. People who don't reach that 3-year mark tend to rotate between many frequent short-term jobs. So that's one reason. The second reason is that most of the countries in Latin America do not have unemployment insurance, and therefore rely on their severance pay systems to bridge a period of unemployment. And a 3-year job tenure gives you access to 3-month severance pay, at least that is your legal entitlement, whether you get it is another issue, and that can tide you over 5 to 6 months of unemployment or inactivity or whatever it is you're not doing during that time, and can serve as some kind of a substitute for an unemployment insurance system. That's the reality of labour markets in Latin America, and this cut-off line has a lot to do with the legal entitlements, not necessarily with practical reality. Again, affiliation, as I explained, if you are not affiliated to a social security system, you are considered to be deprived, and if you're working more than 45 hours also. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but overall you are considered to be deprived across all three dimensions if you are deprived in at least a third of the indicator. So that would mean you can be deprived in income, or you could be deprived in occupational status and social security, or tenure and working hours. So there are numerous combinations possible, but you have to be deprived in at least a third of the indicator's weighting. The results overall are very interesting. This is the first dashboard of results across Latin America, across all countries included. And as you will see, there is a very broad range of data, of results in each dimension. So you have countries with very high levels of deprivation in income, for example, here, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. You have countries with much lower levels of deprivation, such as Uruguay, Chile, and Panama, in that particular dimension. And those results are relatively in line with what we would expect with the level of development of each country. The same goes for the dimension of social security and probably also occupational status. Those results are probably more or less what you would expect. In other dimensions, such as tenure, however, we see that the more developed countries in Latin America have relatively higher levels of deprivation. So Chile, for example, has one of the highest rates of job turnover, along with Peru, Colombia, Brazil, whereas countries such as El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras have lower rates. The reason for this is because these poorer countries have more independent self-employed workers, and self-employed workers have more job stability. They have many other problems, including low income, no social security, etc. But they are their own bosses and decide how long they work for. They don't get fired, and they don't have short-term contracts which are continuously rotated. So that explains partially these results, which at first glance might appear contradictory. And then working hours is somewhat related, for example, to the level of development of each country, but not necessarily. Within each of these dimensions, there's a relatively broad range of results. Now, to summarize these results, the first thing is to add up all of the workers in the labour market who are deprived in at least 1/3 of the dimensions included in the indicator. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but then there is a second measure which measures the intensity of deprivation. Are you deprived in one dimension of the indicator, in two, in three? The more deprived you are, of course, the higher your intensity of deprivation indicator is here on the A score. And then the overall indicator is simply a product of the two scores. So H times A gives you MO, and that's the actual indicator score at the end of the day. And this is what we use. In the same way that multidimensional poverty is measured with the same methodology, we use the same methodology also to measure the quality of employment. In each country, the three dimensions contribute differently to the indicator. So this graph shows very nicely how in some countries income is more important in terms of the overall result of the indicator. In other countries, it can be social security or job stability. For example, here we have Chile, where that is a relatively large component of the indicator, probably larger than what you would expect. And also in some countries, especially lower income ones like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, the social security dimension, of course, is very, very important. And this is even though we are only considering social security affiliation, not contribution. This is just to show you that you can break these results down. This is the breakdown into the gender dimension. The bad news is that in no country in Latin America, women have better jobs on average than the men. The relatively better news is that the gender gap in some countries is smaller than in others. And even though we haven't done a detailed study of this yet, we do expect that these gender results over time have decreased, that the gender gap over time has decreased. When you look at the age decomposition, these results are pretty intuitive as well. Younger workers tend to have lower quality jobs than older workers, or than the ones who are in the medium part of the age scale. And older workers, again, tend to have more precarious jobs. The education level results are also completely intuitive. People with higher levels of education have better jobs than people with lower levels of education. But I think really the astonishing thing here is that only complete tertiary education gives you some, I wouldn't say guarantee, but a significantly better chance of having a good quality job. So it's really, the big drop is here, from here to here, between complete secondary and complete tertiary education. Now, theoretically one might expect that the more developed a country, the more it's grown, the tighter the labour market, the better the jobs. That was the original expectation that we picked up from the literature, and that we plotted on this chart just to see whether actually the quality of jobs is really related to the level of employment. Now, in an ideal world, you would want your country to be here, actually below this. This starts at 30%, this graph. So ideally, you'd want to be below that and at a high level of participation. So say, let's say 75% up here and somewhere between 0 and 20% in terms of quality of employment. And as you can see, no country in Latin America is there. Some countries have high levels of participation rate, Peru and Nicaragua, for example, but with significantly low levels of quality of employment. Other countries have much lower participation rates, like Chile, for example, has a low level of job quality as well, but certainly the participation rate is nowhere where it should be. And you have other outliers, such as Honduras, where, to be frank, everything is bad. So the bubbles here represent the size of the population. So you can see roughly and imagine how many workers are affected by this. This is not related in any way to the level of development of a country necessarily, except for this group of Central American countries here. There's no clear relationship between the quantity and the quality of jobs. The same happens when we look at the unemployment rate. So again, the ideal scenario would be to have a very low unemployment rate, like Panama there, and a very low level of job quality. Chile has a slightly low level of job quality, but a higher level of unemployment. And again, there are countries here which have a very, very low rate of unemployment, but have terrible job quality, like Guatemala here, Bolivia also, Nicaragua, Honduras, Paraguay, El Salvador, are sort of the group of countries where these conditions are the worst. And Brazil and Colombia, you have high unemployment and a medium job quality level. If you look at income inequality, the overall picture shows that there's again no relationship between the Gini index and the job quality level. So remember, this is the higher your job quality index is, the poorer your quality of employment overall in the country. What's interesting here is also to look at this by income decile, and so what we've done here. This is the two most developed and the two least developed countries in Latin America, just to compare them. So the bad news is that if you're in the lower end of the income distribution in the first decile, the chances of having a poor quality job are almost absolute. The poorer countries, you have to go very far into the income distribution for these levels to come down. So even if you're in the top income decile, 55% of jobs are still of poor quality. That picture looks much, much more positive in Chile and Uruguay, where the 10th income decile generally has good jobs. But if you're in the lower income of the income distribution, wherever you are, whichever level of country you're in, things are pretty bad. So, just briefly to conclude, this methodology, I think, or this study shows that you can measure the quality of employment and the quality of jobs, even though many actors would disagree about the methodology, about the dimensions included, the variables, the cutoff lines. All of that is open for discussion, but you can compare this across countries. That's a very important conclusion because that hasn't been really done before, not with this level of detail. The second conclusion in this is that when you're looking at individual countries, the ideal scenario would be for every country to find what's best for them. So certainly Chile comes out very good here, but it's also because the Latin American region is a very low bar for Chile. So if we were developing this indicator for Chile, we would use slightly different variables in the construction of the indicator. So it's important to generate a national consensus about how to measure the quality of employment, and then hopefully measure it over time in conjunction with measuring the quantity of employment, i.e. the participation rates and the unemployment rates. Just generally to give you an overview, I've shown you that the indicators of job quality don't necessarily have a relationship with macroeconomic variables, but over time, as the country grows, they do improve, at least they have done in the case of Chile. But it's a very slow, gradual improvement. What moves this indicator is not economic growth, it's regulatory change. So if you change the number of hours by regulation that workers work, that produces a change, and that was done from 48 to 45. Or if you made self-employed workers contribute to the social security system, that would immediately present a change. So those are the kind of things that we need to think about, I think, going forward, in terms of how we regulate the labour market, in terms of these variables, in order to improve job quality, not just in Chile, but also in Latin America. So I will conclude there, and pass the microphone to
Agradecemos a